Analytics virtual chapter, and just really excited to be able to share. So I'm the CEO of Think Data Insights. We are a Nashville-based consulting group that focuses on building custom analytics solutions, business intelligence solutions for typically small, medium-sized businesses. And I want to share really a little bit of our experience around sort of the project journey and kind of a little bit about why projects kind of fail and have challenges. This won't be your typical top 10 reasons for a BI or data warehouse project failure. This is a little bit more of how to make it successful. So what I want to focus on today is a few key areas that we find tend to be problematic in the analytic journey. So a couple of things that will really build the foundation for that. You've probably heard a lot of talk around data culture, and data culture is, of course, an important topic when it comes to looking at why organizations have challenges around analytics. And with that, we'll look at some barriers to building analytics and how you can build bridges there. And I'll actually give you a couple of tools in that process that will hopefully help you build successful analytic projects in your organization. And then through the use of Excel and Power BI tools, we've been able to actually make some really strong headway into organizations that had previously really struggled to move along those projects. And so as part of this presentation, I will go through basically key portions of the Power BI, the Power Tools stack within Excel, and show you some demonstrations of how to use those to really deal with some challenging issues. And finally, kind of wrapping that up, the key here is really about empowering leaders, empowering analysts to really change the culture. So today we'll go through a couple things. I just want to share briefly about my experience, who I am, and kind of why I'm sharing this. Go into a little deeper dive around what data culture is and its impact, and kind of describe a little bit of dysfunctional versus functional analytics and with the way to build bridges there. And as part of empowering teams that are working in the analytics space, we'll go through the process itself of what it looks like to kind of prototype analytics, kind of put it in action. And at the end, I'll share a couple of links, some tools that are available to you, and kind of a challenge, if you will, with a little bit of homework. So with that, I'll just start with who I am. So my background really is a technical background. I started out in 6th grade writing programs, got my first computer. So I was kind of that geek that really wanted to spend a lot of time on the computer. And from there, I went on, studied computer science, got into really some great opportunities to build custom solutions more from a programming standpoint, designing databases. So I really got to experience what it looks like to see applications and how they need to be designed to get data in. And I got to understand a little bit of the challenges that creates in getting data out. Back in 2002, I kind of shifted my focus and moved more into the business intelligence space, working with a variety of tools, and along the way picked up SQL Server, Microsoft's SQL Server BI tools, and have worked with that ever since. Well, back in August of this past year was when I mentioned that I stepped out of my role after 16 years with a company and co-founded Think Data Insights. And we really are focused on, as I mentioned, empowering users, kind of being an evangelist to folks inside an organization, being an advocate both for business analysts, for executives, for decision makers, and architecting solutions along the way that will get them there. So we get really excited about helping people learn how to work that journey, learn how to create successful projects. This is really what gets me fired up, though. So this is my family. This is me. I have 4 kids and love life. And so, I get passionate about really serving and helping in any way I possibly can. So let's talk a little bit about analytics and kind of the history of analytics. If you've lived in the business intelligence space, if you have been creating and architecting solutions, whether it's building reports, writing dashboards, doing ETL projects, designing data warehouses, or doing more analytics work with data through different tools, Excel and otherwise, you kind of are probably familiar with this history a little bit. So early on, before there ever really was, systems to drive data, you really had decision makers saying, hey, can we do better? Maybe, maybe not, I'm not sure, but we'll just keep trying. And then as data started becoming available and tools started becoming available, people started saying, well, let's look at trends and let's look at how we did. And while that was helpful, there's often this process of looking back in a descriptive way. So over time, and here recently, companies have moved more into the predictive realm, trying to map trends, predict data going forward, and try to see, hey, if we change this, what could we do? How could we do if? And that is helpful, but oftentimes it still leaves companies without that true actionable insight. So it's the what if. And so the real kind of holy grail is as companies move into the prescriptive realm where when we take this action, we will cause this effect. And so you want to move your analytics project in the process of getting organizations, getting decision makers to have actionable insight, to have actions after those analytics to say, this is what I will do, and therefore our company will do better. So that's kind of been the history, and we want to try to find, the challenge of starting a project is really understanding where you are, and you have to start from there and go from there to the future. So as we talk about data culture, what I want to kind of share with you with this journey and the prototyping process is this really sets a good stage for understanding why it's broken. And so if you're hoping, I want to see a demo, I want to see it in action, it is coming, I promise. But this really sets a stage for some of the process around it. And I think that is so critical because, as you'll see, sometimes the tools are presented as the answer, and we're finding more and more, and I think everybody understands that it's more of the process that is the answer. So let's put the right process in place. So how do we define data culture? Well, culture itself is simply the beliefs. It's what a group understands, believes, their philosophy, their way of thinking. And so when we think about data culture, those same elements apply. Whereas data culture says, hey, this is how we think data should be used. This is the importance of applying data into key business processes. And so from that, how much will we actually rely upon factual information? I mentioned the early analytics where there was really no analytics, and it relied on experienced people in an organization saying, we ought to do this. This is what we think will be successful. There are still many companies that do that really rely upon those people who have been here 20, 30 years in an organization and simply say, we ought to do it. And the reality is companies cannot rely on that anymore. You have to rely on factual information, data-driven information. And so we believe that the healthiness of a culture, data culture in an organization is directly tied to how they use that factual information. So how does an organization, how do we as practitioners of analytics change a data culture? What do we do to make that effect on our business? Because we hear so often from fellow practitioners, IT, either the business won't listen and they don't understand the backlog, or the business says IT doesn't get it, they're not cranking out work soon enough, and so there's challenges there, and we understand both sides. So that is how we actually begin to change the culture. So first, we have to think about perception. So often, if you live in the IT side and you develop code, you develop programs in projects, we focus on the actual code, we focus on the result and say, look at how complex this was, and look at what I've created. And the reality is the user community says, yeah, but I still can't quite do what I want to do. So perception is it didn't meet the mark. And so we have to change the perception. We have to have successful projects. We also have to create a vision. So we as practitioners, you've heard the phrase from that movie, they build it, they will come. Oftentimes they won't come. Oftentimes they will actually simply keep doing what they were doing before because it's easier. So you have to really create a vision in the organization on how analytics can be used and why it ought to be used. That takes a lot of work, takes proactivity, but we have to do it. It's so important. The other thing we have to recognize, and this is really spoken a little bit to the business crowd, they have to understand the role of IT. So IT, especially when you start talking about Excel, and for those that may attend the follow-up webinar, a lot of analysts live in Excel, and that really scares IT. That all the proliferation of Excel files out there, we hear that phrase Excel hell, because all the different versions of the truth. But IT has a huge responsibility for enterprise readiness, for security, scalability, all those things that are critical to IT and their role. The business has to understand those are important. And so oftentimes they don't, and they simply look at why they're not getting the work done. So again, you kind of see both sides of this. So the flip side of that is IT kind of has to realize, hey, the business really needs to begin to own the insights. We have to start getting champions inside the business to take and run with the process of those insights, those actionable insights. Let the business own those. And then lastly, to change it, you have to realize that there never is going to be a build it one time, we're done, we've provided everything we need to the business. The business changes, data changes, priorities change, and so the whole process is a journey. And if we recognize that on both sides, I think we will start to change the way that the business and IT work together and change that culture. But it is not easy. And some of the barriers that we face can really be very challenging. I've already touched on one. Maybe many of you have experienced this with whichever side of the house you kind of live on, IT or business. Those relationships can be pretty toxic. I was just in a meeting a month ago with a client, and the first meeting I met with the CEO and the business analysts, and they told me about how the IT group wasn't getting things done. I then met with the IT group and the CIO, and they said the business doesn't understand what it takes to get it done. And I thought, how sad. I almost felt like a counselor, and I wanted to bring everybody together and say, listen, do you hear each other? Let's try to find a place in the middle to actually work together, right? Let's walk a mile in each other's shoes and begin to appreciate the challenges from both sides. So that's a big barrier, and that's one of the ways that we can overcome that is to step into each other's shoes and really start to build a bridge between the two. The second barrier is really overly complex tools or even ineffective tools. So I've heard it said that the way to start a big data project is to simply buy the right tool and point the tool at the data. And it is such a naive and shallow view of the process of understanding the complexity of good analytics, the complexity of process over tool. You've got to understand the math and science behind the deeper analytics, the advanced analytics. And so tools themselves have been a challenge, and companies have often spent lots of money with little results, or they have tools and then the IT organization ends up having to be the one that fully supports those tools, and the business organization never really starts to take that on. So we have to overcome that and find the right tools. Of course, we deal with this all the time if we're working with data, and that is the lack of data integration. It is a real challenge that the more complex and the more diverse the data sets are coming into an organization, the more challenging it is to overcome that. And we have to find ways to systematize or automate the integration of data sources, both on-premise company-owned data as well as external data from websites and files and whatnot. And then the last barrier is what we see as a very archaic approach. And we approach analytics with our clients more of an agile approach, where we recognize the value of delivering earlier in the process and getting feedback, and I'll explain that a little bit more how we implement that. So we have to overcome that. I think gone are the days of a team going off for 3 to 6 months and developing something and coming back and presenting that to the business. It just doesn't work very well. The speed of business is too great. So those are the barriers that we see in the process, and the result of those barriers, the results of the dysfunction, and what we believe maybe is a better picture of the functional is what we have here. So you have organizations chasing technology, finding that great tool, and we would just say find the right tool, the good enough technologies. Find what works for your organization. Okay. Often a dashboard project is presented with this flashy whiz-bang, charts and gauges that present data that maybe doesn't even change but once a day. And I would say, and we see much better just implementing good analytics techniques, good integration, focusing on that substance. I mentioned the toxic relationships. Really working on trust and agility, working on delivering successful projects is so critical. And so we, again, I'm talking about the negative, but I really want you to see the positive. I really want you to see the answer to this. Let's stop looking back with data and trending and start moving into predictive causal analysis, finding how to affect change based upon relating data that might show impact into an organization, into the success of an organization. Get the right people and get the right culture. Get people to start thinking in terms of innovating and creating and learning and growing. So often you get stuck in these teams that just kind of exist. They just maintain and exist, and it's not very fun to be around. And the people that probably are a great fit for the innovative teams ultimately end up leaving because they're tired of kind of sitting around in their organization. You may be one of those. You may be sitting in an organization that you're thinking, I want to innovate. There's so much I want to do, but it just seems like I'm being held back. So be one of those people that starts to press forward and pushes innovation in your organization, in your team. Because of the lack of relying on data, competition ends up outpacing you. So really focus on data-driven solutions, data-driven decision-making. Start collaborating. I mentioned that already. And thinking about how organizations are working together. So often you have both groups kind of doing their own thing, and so this quote I think really pictures that to a T, right? And so we're all hanging on to the elephant, and we're just trying to go at it a different way. So let's come together and focus on working together. Okay. So real briefly, show you a couple of kind of the process of analytics at work and what it looks like. And then we'll jump into some demos around Power BI and the Excel solution. So people talk about big data. We would say everybody's got big data at some scale. Get your big data to a right size. That's what the tools are for, so that organizations and users can do analytics. Right size your analytics. The tools I mentioned, just make them good enough and make them business focused. Certainly IT is going to have some complex tools to do some of the heavy lifting for the need to scale for large data, but make sure that the business users, the analytics folks, have the right tools. So often IT projects are centralized. We would say share the project. Let IT empower the business to coach them and teach them and move them forward, while IT maintains its role and no longer fears that the business that will run away with something and do it incorrectly. They're coaching them. They're empowering them. And as a result of that, IT no longer just has to go build everything, right? They get support from the business. They scale those solutions that are needed, but they get support from the business to build more of the interface for the end users, for the decision makers. This is a big one for us. We really believe, and I would say as a consulting group, we used to do this, where we felt like we had to build this perfect solution. And I don't know if any of you attended the BA conference in San Jose this past month in April, but Rob Colley had a great quote, and he said that with the permanent solution, so often as architects we're thinking, we're going around and we're saying, okay, I think we need plumbing here and here and here, like a plumber building plumbing for a house, but we don't quite know where the faucets are going to be. And so at the end of all of that, oftentimes the faucets aren't even going to be where we thought they would be. And so we need to focus more around leveraging the business knowledge and prototyping solutions that ultimately become permanent solutions, or at least longer lasting solutions. But trying to build that permanent solution at the beginning just does not work very well. Rather than flashy visualizations, just focus on high value. Sometimes a table is all you need. Focus on the ROI, and we'll give you a tool for that. If you're having challenges moving forward in a business, start to calculate some ROI. And finally, do short targeted agile approaches. Okay? So that's kind of that's what it looks like when you have functional analytics at work. You have the right tools, the right projects, the right strategies in place. Okay? So let's jump over. Let me just jump through this because I previously presented this, I had a little more time, and I want to just show you real quick what it really looks like for an agile delivery of analytics. So you really do start as you figure out what you're trying to do. Those analytics ought to tie back to objectives. The objectives organize the team. The team evaluates the data and figures out, you know, what's good, what's bad, how can we use it. They rapidly take that data and present solutions and iterate through that, oftentimes very early delivering insights, and then you see it's a continuous circle, right? We continue to loop and continue to provide feedback and continue to make the data better, and that's what it means to do analytics well, to provide that continuous delivery. So with that, I'm going to jump over into a demonstration, and this is really with the power tools in Excel, we have found companies able to make significant progress around the moving the analytics journey forward. So I'm going to present a challenge here with data and how you'd overcome that. So let me pull up a file here and present it. And so this is sort of the presentation of a collection of data that we pulled out, and as Dan mentioned, we have these samples, we have the PowerPoint and the samples available to you. And so what we have here is a picture of sales, a picture of the profitability, a picture of that trending over time, and we also have a complexity of implementing multiple currencies, and you start to see this picture of data presented in a bit of a challenging way, especially as I show you what is behind this view, okay? So what we want to be able to do is provide a means for a group to be able to understand better what is driving sales. So we know that if you've worked with AdventureWorks data, which is what this is primarily based upon, you're familiar with some of this this information with the categories, subcategories. We have total sales, margin, profit. And so what we want to do is give them a tool where they can understand a little better. So we see some trends around sales and prior year-to-date sales. And by putting this together into a single view, we can start to interact with it. And for this example, I can choose bikes, and I can see how the trend changes for bikes versus component sales. And so I click components, you see the trend change. I can click together the clothing and components, and I see that change. And then I can start to select different currencies. So you'll see different currencies which can be complex to implement, right? And so we choose different currencies based upon the exchange rate. So trying to get the current exchange rates implemented, again, in an automated way can be really challenging. And of course, the ability to then, across all of that, filter and choose different years and so on, still showing the year-to-date and prior year-to-date sales is crucial. So what you're seeing presented here can actually become a usable report that an end user can begin to work in, and creating this visualization when you've done the work of the analytics and the underlying modeling is actually an easy process. So let me show you real quick the data that we had to work with, and you'll see this in your demo downloads. So the first thing we have is a file that can be pretty complex to address with typical tools. There's certainly ways to program around it. But you'll oftentimes get data coming in an odd format. Maybe it was created in a pivot table, or you've downloaded it from a formatted report, and you end up with these different blanks in here. And so that can be challenging. Combine that with the data that you typically might get out of a database. And in this case, we've got the AdventureWorks data warehouse database. And we have the extra challenge with the sales data we have. If you look at the number of rows, we've got about over 300 million rows of data. And for those that have ever worked in Excel, you know that's impossible. Typically, people start thinking, oh, I need to do something in SQL Server. I need to do something with bigger tools. I'm going to show you how that shouldn't be a barrier. You can actually prototype with Power BI even with that volume of data. And lastly, we have an exchange rate table that we have off the internet. This is from xraetz.com. And we have a table that's updated regularly. But the challenge of pulling this down in a format that's usable is really difficult. And then putting all of that data together is even more difficult. So let me show you a little bit of what we do in the analytics prototyping that really makes that a seamless process. So remember, this file format. So we'll start on that one first, and we will go ahead and open up the data, and we're going to go to an Excel file, and you'll see the sales quota source file, and we'll open that up, and it actually is reading the Excel file, and it sees one sheet, but of course that sheet is in odd format, so we're going to use Power Query. Bring that over my screen here. Now what I'd like to do is turn this into a format that looks more transactional. So with relative ease, I'm going to simply eliminate some of these rows. So I'm going to take out that top row, which is meaningless, just one row. And you'll notice, if you follow along on the right side under Applied Steps, you'll notice these actions are recorded, much like a macro. The next thing I'm going to do is turn these first rows into headers. And so you now see that my column names have been picked up from those first rows. Now dealing with the challenge of this value needing to be filled in here, we actually have a place for that. So you'll see here under the Transform menu, we can fill down values, and basically it fills down until it hits a non-null value. And so it filled those in, and now I'm kind of almost there. I've got what looks to be almost transactional data. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to filter the data. So I'm going to eliminate data that does not, I'm only going to include data that does not contain total. Okay? So I want to eliminate these total rows because they're not helpful for me. So now I've eliminated that. Again, I'm recording all the steps. And with a couple more steps, I can actually get this to be in a format that actually is quite usable for our data. So I'm going to do a little replace here and replace the values CY with blank so that we end up with an actual year. And then I'm going to split this column out. Just split it by the space value. So now I've got these two columns. And now I'm going to actually, let me clean this up and just rename a few things. Call it month. Call this year. And I'm going to create a little calculation to help us get the actual date out of here. So that's going to be the month plus the first plus the year. And now I've got a date column from here. And I can convert it to a date type. And lastly, I can go ahead and get rid of these columns. Now, I have taken, certainly I clicked through and did a few steps, but it has recorded all of these. So as this data file comes in and has new data in it, this now is a program that I've written that will apply the data into a format that actually starts to be analyzable. So I'm just going to call it sales targets. And we're going to close. We're going to close this and just simply save the definition of it. I won't get too much into this step here because I want to show you more of the tool. But now we can go back in and we can actually look at it, analyze it, include it in a model. And so it becomes a part of, I've turned it into a table. It was originally this Excel file. I've turned it into a table. Very powerful feature. The second thing I want to show is the web service. So I showed you this page right here. And so often we hear stories of people scraping the page, you know, or just going through the challenging processes. And what I'd like to do is actually take this and access it through a web service call. And so we have that ability to either hit a page, pull a table from the page, or if there's a web service, to access it through a web service. So I've entered the web page URL. It's kind of going out to the page and saying, yeah, what are you trying to do there? I've got several things I see on the page. It's got this rate table preview, which was the top 10. I'm not interested in that. And then it's got this full table. That's the one I'm interested in. So I take that, and here's the query that I do. And same thing with the other query. I can manipulate that, clean it up, tie a date to it if I want, expand it and link in the currency lookup, ultimately to get a set of data that's going to match the other data that I'm bringing in. and that is from the AdventureWorks Data Warehouse. So the final sort of step in that, as we create the currency lookup, the exchange rates that you can see here, is actually then to combine it into a single model. So I'm going to jump over here into our solution and show you a little bit of that. So if you've worked in databases at all, if you've spent some time either in PowerPivot, this will look familiar. If you spent time in Access or just building tables and doing VLOOKUPs, you'll find that the experience of PowerPivot allows you now to model the data. So we've turned our sales quota data into a table, we've turned our currency exchange rate data into a table, and we've brought in this reseller sales table, which was about 300 million just directly from the database. And we've actually created a model now that we can query and look up to get the information we need. And more than that, through the use of various calculations, you'll see here's a pivot table simply created from that model, and you'll see the volume of data we got here. And with each of these rows of data, with the currency, etc., you see 304 million rows of data, and you see the ease of which we drill into the data. Okay, so the PowerPivot model allows you to break those barriers of performance, of the volume of data that you're dealing with. Very, very powerful, and those alone typically cause IT groups to spend 1 to 2 months just building an infrastructure to handle that volume of data. We may find in a week or two that the need that originally drove this project is no longer there. So why spend 1 to 2 months putting in place something that ultimately will go away or at some point pivot? Okay, so that's a quick look at the Power Query and how we're able to solve just the different data type challenges. Okay, so I'm going to switch over here real quick. Bear with me just 1 second. I wanted to flip through this. Hang on just a second. So when we get to the challenge of the data, as I've mentioned, depending on where your location, the data is located, whether it's in the cloud, on-premise, you're dealing with files, that can be a challenge. What type of data, if it's big, if it's non-tabular, doing counts, social media text, etc. How clean is it? How do we address that? And then how do we extract it? And what's the cost to acquire or store it? So all of those we believe are solved through Power Query, through the tools, and you can see the amount of data that you can connect to, and it's growing over, Microsoft is basically releasing a new version every, I think about every month at this stage. So Power Query is probably one of the greatest enablers we've seen of moving analytics along in the process. Okay, so let's talk about the process itself now. Spend a couple minutes here. The process of actually going forward and building the models themselves and building the visualization. So it's really, really important to create an effective design process. So you want to start with where you're trying to end up, what objective we're trying to design to, and what are the theories that we have about the data. Start with small data, start with variables that make an impact into that, build your calculations, build your model, and visualize it early. Visualizing it early is tough when you don't have the data integrated. That's why we think Power Query is such a great tool for that. So traditionally, that has come by way of standard reports, ad hoc reports, querying, drilling down, creating alerts, and those are all well and good, especially when the data is stable and typically the structure is not changing a whole lot. However, getting into deeper analytics about the why, about more of extrapolation of forecasting and predictive modeling. So we want to kind of think about where we are in the process and in the tool, using the tools for each of these areas. So if you look at the stack overall, and where we see Power Query, as I showed you, being an enabler of integrating the data, Power Pivot then enables us to model it, as you saw, in a database format. Now we have a lot of options to visualize the data through Excel, through Power View, through Power Map, and even into Power BI. Some of you may have connected and opened up the Power BI preview site and seen some of the ways that you can visualize that. So let's take a look real quick at visualizing in Excel. So I mentioned to you we have this great view that we put together, and we could add to it, we could create more trends, but how difficult is it to create these, especially given all the complexity of the data? Let's take a look at that. So I'm going to insert a PowerView chart, or PowerView report, and you'll see here the data that we have available to us is all of the data that we've included in the model. So ultimately, we want to take a look at total sales, and we'll simply drop that into the report. And we want to see that by category, so we'll drop that into the report. And we then want to view that as a chart, drop that in as a chart. And I'm going to drop out a few of these fields. And drop that over here. We'll start with category. So you can see that this screen is more of a canvas that I can start to work with and try to figure out, how is it that I want to show this data? How do I want to trend the data? So let's now take a look at year-to-date sales, and we'll just drop it over here. And prior year-to-date sales. We'll bring it here. And we will incorporate the month on top of that. And lastly, we'll just stick us a little filter here on the page so that we can filter the entire view based upon the year. Okay, so you can see here. Now that's good. I might be able to show it in text format, or go ahead and visualize that as a line. And so now I can take this view and spread that out a little bit. Now let's take the next step. We incorporated currency exchange rate conversion, which was a matter of getting the exchange rates and then simply creating a calculation in the model that multiplied the US dollar value against the exchange rate that we have currently in the model. So I'm going to actually include our currency names here. And by default, let me just shrink that a little bit. Don't take so much screen space. Okay, by default, this is going to show up here and going to filter for us across the entire, I'll turn it into a slicer, across the entire report. So now I can select a different currency, and this is going to show in that native currency. Okay, got to find one that there we go, Brazilian. Okay, and you see it affects the whole report. The other thing is, I showed you in the beginning the ability to then filter based upon one or more of these values. So you see this actually happens by default. You would not believe the power. This may look simple if you've created reports, if you've used any visualization tools, but the ability to sit in a meeting with an end user, with an executive, to be able to take that model and essentially iterate through the design of a report right there, rather than saying, well, I'll go back and then we'll meet tomorrow and I'll see if I heard you right and show what what you did. We typically will spend 2 days with a team and work through the design, and we come away with something that is so usable. And that's not to brag on us. I hope that didn't sound like that. It's just the process we use is so functional and so workable. So there's obviously some cleanup and shrinking and moving around that we could do. We could incorporate different aspects of the model, incorporate the sales targets as well, where we were against target. As you can see, the process itself becomes so agile as a result of being able to present the data. And the other thing that it does that we often don't find out about until we've delivered some kind of report or some kind of analysis, that the end user says, I don't trust this, and here's why. And they find data quality issues. Well, you don't want them finding data quality issues. You want to be able to identify those and be able to talk about that while you're working through iteratively with the end user, with the executive. So it's a very powerful process to be able to do that. And though we maybe aren't quite looking like this, yeah, we dropped a few totals in here as well, you can see that this canvas really allows you to iterate through that. And I'll show you next the fact that we're not done. So oftentimes people say, well, great, you've created it in Excel, but I don't want to deliver a bunch of Excel workbooks, right? So through the use of Power BI, and I will go ahead and connect to Power BI. Just one moment here. And this is currently the Power BI preview site. If you've never logged into it, you'll see that basically they've taken the Power Query, the Power Pivot functionality, and some of the Power View functionality, and they've really wrapped that into a cloud-based dashboard solution where I can deploy my model, and you see this model with 300 million rows. I can deploy that and then build reports off of it, and it will synchronize. We used OneDrive to do that. There are other ways to accomplish it. And I can then create my dashboards to be able to then drill into different views of the data, to be able to slice different views of the data. So you recognize the look, and as you can see here, I can then interact and kind of understand a little better about what's driving these different values. Okay, and we do that all through the Power BI. So now you notice this is not Excel. The end user experience is not Excel. It's a cloud-based reporting tool that was empowered by the use of the Power Query, the Power Pivot, and the Power View writing and deployed into the cloud. So it's just a great process to be able to use and to prototype. And if you're getting pushback in funding, then a great tool for that is actually to be able to show it and then show the ROI based on that. So let's talk about that real quick and kind of the automation aspect. So when you've created these Excel workbooks and you've created the Power Pivot model and you've connected to all these data sources, what do you do when you push all that up into the cloud? How do you connect to these data sources, some of which might be local files, some of which might be databases that your IT administrator says there is no way we're going to connect Power BI or SharePoint or 365 back to our database. We're not going to do it. And so you're stuck. Well, we use a tool called PowerUpdate, and I'll have a link here for a free version of it, where you can take a Power Pivot cube and the Power Queries behind it and actually auto-refresh that and deploy it on a scheduled basis just through a basic Windows workstation, or you can deploy it on a server. And it's a great utility because that sort of that takes all the work you've done and that puts basically an enterprise automation component to it. Now you can take it from data file all the way up to deploy it into the cloud without ever having to invest a ton in infrastructure. And again, the need may dissolve and then you haven't spent a whole lot, or this may finally move something forward that you've been sitting on for months. So PowerUpdate has become a critical component of that, and there's a lot of capabilities there with the ability to refresh, and it incorporates into SharePoint, into Power BI version 1, 365, into Power BI Preview. So let me show you that real quick and jump over here to PowerUpdate. And as I said, there is a free version, and so I will show you the link for that. But basically, once you've created your workbook, you install this tool into an environment that has access to the workbook, to the databases, to the files, and you simply create a refresh task, whatever you want to call it. How often do you want to refresh, which is really nice, because if you've got something that needs to be refreshed every hour, you can do that. When do I want to refresh it? How often? Repeat it every hour and so on. Where do I want to deploy this to? I may just simply want to deploy my workbook out to a network drive, right? You're in beta and you just simply want to put it out there and let people work on it, then you can do that. If you use SharePoint, you can do that. And if there's anyone that has already begun working in the SQL Server analysis services space around tabular modeling, you can actually take a Power Pivot and after the refresh, deploy that Power Pivot into a tabular server. So it's just a super powerful tool, and again, it really moves you weeks into a project over getting to jump past all of the work that you typically use to automate. Okay, you can refresh a single workbook, you can deploy it into SharePoint, You can also update multiple workbooks if you have the full version, or update it from a library. And then you pick the workbook, and you're done. You've got your refresh job, and it's set and it runs based upon the timing you specified. So we think it's a great tool, and every project we've done where we're doing this more prototyping into an enterprise deployed environment, PowerUpdate has been a key part of that. So that's PowerUpdate. You see the suite from end to end with Power Query, the Power Tools, Power Pivot, and so on, and then PowerUpdate. So let me tell you about the tools that we think are critical to a prototyping analyst. Okay, so you know when you go to design and model and figure things out, and you're presenting, especially when you're trying to present a proof or a case justification for a project. This is kind of what you're typically working with, and behind the scenes, you're modeling, so you're using Excel and Power Query and whatnot, and then the output of that you might then deploy through using PowerUpdate 365, even Azure if you get into deeper analytics, using R. Some folks are leveraging that. Machine learning, which I think is going to be mentioned in the next in one of your later talks. We think these now come together as a process that's together. You can design, model, and visualize all together and really do it in a more agile way. So here's kind of the challenge I would give you. First of all, the tools. I'm going to leave this up for a second. I mentioned there's two tools. We have a calculator that is a pretty simple calculator, but it incorporates some of the variables that we think are critical to successful agile implementation and successful ROI calculation. And so you can download that from this link. And then there's also a free version of PowerUpdate. And so you download that and install it. If you find the need to do some of those features like refresh multiple workbooks, update a SharePoint library, deploy into Tabular, then you can purchase the full version. But this is a fully functional free version that allows you to do most everything that you want. And so these links are included in the PowerPoint as well. So when you download that, you'll see that. So that's hopefully a tool that will help you in your journey in moving analytics forward. And then I would just say, kind of as a challenge to you, think about something you've been stuck on, working on, or an idea in the business that is a little outside of your typical work schedule. Figure out what the ROI would be. Do a little work and figure out that. Get a team together, even if it's kind of a skunk works team, right? Hey, we're going to work on this on the side in the evening. We want to create something and kind of highlight what can be done, and then just really blow them away. And I'm telling you that when we sit in on meetings where people finally see what they've not been able to see and can start to get insights into taking action into their business, they really are blown away, and it's a great thing. So you kind of from there hopefully reshaping the culture of analytics in your organization, moving from a negative scarcity-minded, we can't do it mindset to let's work together, let's empower each other, and let's move the ball forward to help an organization succeed. So with that, I'm going to pause and open it up to questions. And Dan, I guess maybe hand that back to you at that point and see if there's any questions from you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ken. Great content. Nice demos. Very good. All right. We do have some questions for you. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So the first one here, so they're asking, how do you set the expectations with your users and stakeholders, especially when you're designing these kind of, we would consider them proof of concept, prototype projects, specifically about, what elements you might keep and throw away going forward as you go to a more larger enterprise solution?
Right. Well, I think it's a great question. I think setting the expectation starts first by kind of showing up and hearing what their real problem is. So often we miss that, and we kind of think we know, and we present what we think is going to be a great solution. So that's kind of the first thing. You deal with that, and they know that they've been heard. Secondly is you get them engaged. So I think expectation is set when they actually see the process itself and they're involved in it, meaning, hey, come sit with me for 2 to 4 hours today and we're going to work through this data. And they start to see the data quality issues. they start to see the challenges of how you're going to present the data in a meaningful way. And that's why we think that process works so well, is because now we're not just telling them, they're actually seeing that. But then the other part of that is, I think that whole setting expectations thing goes away because they get so caught up in what can be done that they're really focusing, the wheels are turning about the possibilities over the expectations. So that's kind of, in general, it almost seems like that deals with that expectation. But then the other part is sometimes you just have to say hard things, right? You have to say, we can't do that, but here's what we can do, and here's where we'll get you to in a week or 2 or 3, and this is what it's going to take to go further down the road. So let's see what we can do now. And if you can deal with their now, you've really addressed the expectation question.
Okay, here's another question, just kind of piggyback off that. So they said that they want to continue to use Power BI for a permanent solution, not just for prototyping, and SharePoint is not an option. Will this work as far as like security models? I mean, should there be some concerns there? How do they limit the
Yes,
data?
absolutely. So without SharePoint and without the tabular side, you can address security and you can address deployment. So you have Office 365 and the SharePoint Online, which is an option to deploy, and you have some limitations with the file size of the Power Pivot. You do have the Power BI service on top of that, which extends the limits, the file sizes, and then of course you have the Power BI preview, and you always have Excel with Power Pivot capabilities. So the security part, you can always write DAX calculations into the measures, into the calculations you create that account for the current user. So we do that a lot, where we will filter measure values based upon the current user, and typically you need to have a lookup table of all the users and things like that. But you can bake that into the model. It takes a little bit more time, but you can bake that into the model, into each calculation, and still apply that same filtering technique. Don't get the deployment part, don't get hung up on that too much. Make sure that you've got momentum on the usability in the project. Then you can keep moving forward with just straight up Excel on a network drive, even if you have to.
Perfect. Okay, that does wrap up our hour. Ken, any last parting words of wisdom?
As I said before, don't let the frustration and the challenges of a business that typically thinks there's not a solution to stop you. What people want to see is results. That client example I told you about, they wanted to see results. And so once we started showing how they could do that, the whole tone of the group and the organization changed. So go out there, blow people away. Don't get hung up on making it perfect. Make it good enough, and you'll find you'll start to succeed, and people will get excited about it. And I think you'll have a great time doing it. So really appreciate y'all allowing me to talk today.
All right, and just thanks again, Ken. And just to let everyone know, there were more questions. I will send these questions to Ken so that he can follow up with you. Otherwise, they do have your website was Think Data Insights.
It is thinkdatainsights.com, yes.
And you can send questions there as well. Thank you once again, and just remember there will be a short survey once you sign off today. Please fill that out and give us some feedback, and we can follow up with Ken as well. Thanks again, Ken. Greatly appreciate your time.
You bet. Thank you, Dan, and thank you everybody for taking the time today. I appreciate it.
Have a nice day, everyone. Just remember that there is an Excel BI virtual chapter meeting right after this as well, if you're interested in checking that out. It's by Steve Hughes, and he's building dashboards in Excel. Thanks again, Ken. Have a good day.
Thank you.